Hi, fourth graders. This is day 4 of George versus George. We're starting with the Tides of War, 1776 to 1783. The Declaration of Independence may have sounded great to American rebels, but George Washington's army was getting trounced. I think I shall soon hear loyal subjects returning to that duty they owe to an indulgent sovereign, King George. That's King George saying he thinks American colonists are going to turn back and join his side. It was Christmas 1776, and the weather was bitter cold. A well-equipped army of 1,400 British-backed Hessian troops was encamped in Trenton, New Jersey, where their commandant was sleeping off a holiday feast. George Washington and his dejected volunteer army of about 6,000 sick, starving, and mostly barefoot rebels had little to celebrate. They had been on the run all the way from New York through New Jersey, finally reaching Pennsylvania, where they camped across the Delaware River from the enemy. In just 1 week, about half of these men were due to leave for home when their enlistment time ran out. Imagine running barefoot in the freezing cold. Desperate for a victory, Washington had decided to chance a surprise attack on the Hessians. Along with about 2,400 soldiers who were strong enough to fight, he spent an entire afternoon and night crossing the ice-choked Delaware River in blinding sleet and snow. They covered their muskets with blankets to keep them dry and marched 9 miles towards Trenton in profound silence. Washington's men ambushed, remember that means a surprise attack, the sleeping Hessians, who were taken completely by surprise. The disorganized Hessian commander and 150 of his men were killed. The Continental Army captured well over 900 Hessians, and not a single American died in the battle. As soon as he heard that Washington had clobbered the Hessians, British General Charles Lord Cornwallis sent another 8,000 men to Trenton to teach the rebels a lesson. Washington and his outnumbered but spirited troops went on to win the Second Battle of Trenton on January 2nd, 1777, and they won again at Princeton the very next day. In just 10 days, Washington's victories had turned the entire war around. Now both sides knew that the Americans had a real army and a chance of winning the war. Many men who were about to leave for home signed on to fight again. Pause here and jot down, why was it so important that the Americans win these battles? Why was it so important that the Americans win these series of battles? That September, British troops, aided by American loyalists, outfoxed Washington at Brandywine Creek. About 1,400 of his men were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Plundering all the farms in their path, British forces headed straight for Philadelphia, America's capital city. That was before Washington, D.C. was founded. The Continental Congress fled in great confusion, and the British Army paraded joyfully into the city without firing a shot. In a fierce battle on October 4th, Washington was narrowly defeated at Germantown and lost his chance to retake Philadelphia. Once again, it looked like the rebel army would never beat the British. King George was thrilled. Meanwhile, in northern New York, another rebel force led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold was having better luck. After a series of battles in September and October 1777, the rebels surrounded British troops at Saratoga and forced their entire army to surrender. It was the biggest blow yet for the crown and turned the tide of war back in favor of America. This time, the king was agonized when he heard the news. That means he was really upset by it. To hide his concern, King George tried so hard to make merry in public that he embarrassed all his friends. He paid no attention to anybody who thought the British would lose. During the winter of 1777 and 1778, large number of King George's supporters in England, Scotland, and Wales signed up to go fight against America. At the same time, a noisy debate was raging about whether the war should continue. Members of Parliament who were sympathetic to the rebels, that means they understood how the rebels were feeling, even argued that anyone who helped the British war effort was a criminal. In February, a huge crowd of swearing men and tearful women women created an uproar outside the Parliament, then broke down the doors and stamped their way to hear an especially exciting debate. Back in America, it was too cold to fight. Gangs of loyalists and civilians pretending to be patriot militia went on looting and burning sprees. Meanwhile, British Mayor General Dandy Sir Billy Ho spent his time winning and dining his troops in warm, comfortable Philadelphia homes. He rode about in an elegant coach, attending every ball, play, and cockfight in town. Washington and his half-naked army of skeletons, that means they were so thin because they hadn't been eating, suffered through another freezing winter, this time 18 miles outside of Philadelphia at Valley Forge. There was no money to buy food. Farmers sold their crops and cattle to British troops who had plenty of money to spend. About 2,500 of Washington's 11,000 men starved, froze to death, or died from smallpox or pneumonia, and many more deserted. That means they ran away. Congress didn't pay the army for weeks and weeks. Frustrated and angry, Washington wrote Congress that his men had not even the shadow of a blanket. So his poor troops were not getting any food or shelter because they didn't have money to pay for it. But the British troops had so much money they could pay for warm places to stay. Some people thought the Continental Congress should fire General Washington for losing his recent battles and replace him with Horatio Gates, who had won at Saratoga. But Washington wasn't fired. His shoeless men built 1,000 crude huts using timber they cut and trimmed themselves. A Prussian volunteer named Baron von Steuben arrived to teach military drills to the men, and with great reluctance, Washington finally sent his starving soldiers to seize livestock and produce from supporters of the crown. Wholehearted respect and affection for Washington was so great that for each man who deserted the army, 100 more stayed until the spring to fight for their cause and country. It seems like these men are really passionate and loyal to what they believe in. Once there was food to eat, recruits began pouring in. The training was paying off too. Washington's ragtag soldiers had finally become professionals. The king's critics, that means the people who didn't agree with the king, still howled at that the war wasn't worth the cost. People were losing their jobs because Great Britain no longer sold goods to Americans. In London, redcoats killed 500 unemployed workers who were rioting in the streets. The French greatly admired the American cause. On February 6, 1778, King Louis of France signed a treaty that recognized the United States as a new nation. He promised to send ships, soldiers, and money to help the rebel army fight his old enemy, the British. All this time, the flames of war raged on. Out on the western frontier, George Rogers Clark led about 170 men on an 18-day march through a flooded river of icy water up to their knees, chests, and necks to capture a British fort at Vincennes in Indian country. In the North Sea near Britain, American John Paul Jones' old armed merchant ship, Bonamy Richard, captured the new British warship Serapis. More and more black soldiers were fighting for both sides. In the southern states, some slave owners, too lazy or afraid to fight, sent their slaves to fight instead. A visitor to the mostly black Rhode Island regiment said it was the most neatly dressed, the best underarms, and the most precise in its movements. In May 1780, the Patriots lost Charleston, South Carolina, along with 5,500 soldiers and 4 ships. It was the worst defeat of the war. Just from reading these last couple pages, you can see how chaotic everything is. People in Britain don't agree with the war, so there's trouble going on there. In France, they're sending over supporters to the United States. The United States is still having problems with the Indians and fighting the British. It seems like it's getting really crazy everywhere that's involved. So what was happening to American civilians all this time? For one thing, the vicious Civil War was being fought between Americans in favor of independence and Americans who were against it. In the North, rebels broke into homes of Americans loyal to King George and hauled them off to prison. Because remember, some Americans didn't want to fight in the war and they wanted to stay citizens of the British Empire. Quakers couldn't fight for religious reasons. The Patriots tarred and feathered them anyway, even when they hired substitutes. When time got too rough, Loyalists fled to the British colonies of Canada and Nova Scotia, where the government gave them money to pay for their losses. Brutality was even worse in the South, where families were ripped apart and neighbors murdered neighbors. Meanwhile, the Redcoats were trying to terrorize rebel supporters into giving up. Besides constantly stealing food and horses, they burned entire towns and villages, looted or seized people's houses, murdered innocent civilians, and set fire to crops and timberland. British troops locked prisoners in filthy prison ships where they died like flies from starvation, heat, cold, and disease. Indians fighting alongside the British burned almost 1,000 homes, tortured and killed whole families, and scalped the dead. Believing that it would make them more powerful, some Indians honored their bravest victims by eating them. For revenge, rebel troops sent by George Washington destroyed 41 Native American villages, many which were peaceful, and burned all their crops and orchards. They collected scalps and showed off pairs of leggings made from the skin of the dead Indians. The Iroquois people call George Washington Town Destroyer to this very day. Both sides are showing such extreme violence, and people from both sides are dying. Plenty of women were involved in the war too. Some of them served as spies or guides. A Quaker housewife living across from British headquarters in Philadelphia often overheard information about Redcoat war plans. She sewed the news inside cloth-covered buttons and sent her young son to deliver them to George Washington. A black woman named Quamino Dolly guided British soldiers through a swamp so that they could sneak up behind the rebel troops and capture Savannah, Georgia. Women on both sides regularly traveled with the soldiers, who were often their husbands. Sometimes they even brought along their children. They cooked food, cleaned out the cannons, washed clothes, made bandages, knit socks, nursed the sick, and laid out the dead. When there was no fighting, they danced and sang with the soldiers, but when times got tough, some women fought in battles alongside the men. George Washington's wife, Martha, spent 8 winters with her husband, and she worked just as hard as anyone. Flirtatious German-speaking women in Pennsylvania lured lots of Hessian soldiers into trading their hard military life for an American wife and farm. And there were often romances between American women and dashing British soldiers, quartered in private homes. We're going to start tomorrow with the final battle. I want you to pause right now and just take note of some of the things that are happening on both sides. There's terrible things of violence and brutal fighting going on. I want you to take notes of some of the things that both sides are doing. See you tomorrow.